For millennia, folks around the world have passed down stories of lost treasure, both by land and by sea. Across all corners of the planet, you're bound to happen upon a tale of buried gold, misplaced riches, or disappeared diamonds, no matter who it is you speak to or whatever ledger you pick up and read. Some treasure stories revolve around ancient artifacts, detailing the past lives of lost civilizations, resources of newfound knowledge, and historical enlightenment. Others revolve around mankind's inherent drive towards wealth and fortune, often coming with lessons on greed, materialism, and the consequences of conquest. Usually, these types of tales take place on the coasts of untamed waters, or in unexplored territories of countries far from America, much less the western frontier. However, when taking a closer look at the records and textbooks detailing life in the American West, you'll find there are plenty of similar stories regarding gold, artifacts, and other legendary loot circulating around west of the Mississippi River. Thus, to better grasp the lore surrounding treasure-laden quests from across the frontier, here is our next exploration into tales of lost treasure originating in the Wild West. Introducing the legend of the hidden treasure of Victorio Peak in southern New Mexico. The earliest point in history associated with the lost treasure of Victorio Peak takes us back to the end of the 16th century. It was a period of conquest in the west central regions of North America, when Spain claimed much of the land spanning from the basin of present-day Alaska through the western half of Canada, the western half of the future United States, and the western half of South America. The year was 1598, and the Spaniard conquistador Don Juan de Oñate has recently established the next colony of New Spain, called New Mexico. His tactics against the native Pueblo folk of the American Southwest were dastardly, so much so, these actions gave birth to his legacy as being that of a cruel, uncaring leader. It's said that during his provincial conquest in the modern-day United States, Oñate searched desperately for the 7 cities of gold, known as Cibola in Spanish lore. While these mythical locales were never officially documented, it's said the conquering Spaniard still accrued a worthy trove of treasures, mostly gold and jewelry, before his reign ended. In 1606, Oñate was ordered to return to Mexico City. He knew he couldn't return south of the border with all of his riches and artifacts in tow, and schemed up a plan to hide it. Forcing a band of imprisoned indigenous folk to carry out his brutish bidding, he tortured the natives with intense physical labor to bury his cache somewhere in the New Mexico desert. His ultimate plan was to return at a later date and retrieve the hidden treasure. But due to Oñate's disturbing subjection of both Native Americans and Spanish colonists, he was barred from ever returning to New Mexico henceforth. He returned to Spain, where he worked as the head of mining inspectors until his death in 1626. He drew his last breath, ignorant to the fate of his forsaken wealth. The next chapter in the Victorio Peak treasure came 170 years later in 1797. The western half of North America, namely the United States and Mexico, was still peppered with Spanish missions and religious settlements. Thus, priests of all sorts of nationalities made it their quest to traverse the frontier, building churches and developing their congregations. French priest Father Leroux was one of these leaders who heard their calling on the arid deserts of New Spain. He was a recent transplant to Durango, Mexico in '97, when he received news that could change his life. While in Durango, a soldier stationed near the church alerted Leroux of a massive gold deposit rumored to be buried north of Paso del Norte. It was a 2-day trip to the location of the deposit, but before he could leave, the priest needed permission from the church. Church officials denied Father Leroux of his request for absence, but the lust of gold was too strong for the priest to ignore. Despite the lack of consent, he set off for the mountains of the Hembrio Basin, thinking he'd atone for his sins at a later date. Once he and his mining troupe arrived in New Mexico, though, they'd soon be ensnared by the grandeur of gold for good. LaRue and company tunneled into the mountains, reaping the rewards for years on end. A fault in the basin created a cave where most of the gold was stored, LaRue amassing an endless cache of riches before his very eyes. While his wealth increased, so did the greed and jealousy of his peers back in Mexico. The Mexican government was especially disgruntled by LaRue's defection of his duties, and when they received word of his glimmering discovery, they sent a faction of soldiers into New Mexico. Their mission? Find LaRue, and their directive? Take the treasure and kill him. Father LaRue caught wind of the impending ambush just before the Mexicans struck, and convinced enough of his most devoted followers to aid in his defense on Victorio Peak. They fought valiantly when the cavalry arrived, but it was too much firepower for the scroungy, mission-turned-militia to overcome. Before they were all extinguished, though, the Mexican army tried everything under the sun to learn of the gold's secret location. They tortured LaRue's followers, bringing them within an inch of their life. But even then, they were too devoted to their French priest to break. LaRue himself was beaten and bruised and thrashed into submission, but he refused to let his knowledge be spilled. Legend goes that as LaRue's heart finally gave out, he screamed to the heavens, laying a curse on anyone who uncovered his gold or told his foes of its hiding place. Mexico searched like mad to uncover the treasure, but their efforts were fruitless. Father LaRue's legacy was stashed away in the Hembrio Basin. Some believe this gold discovered by Father LaRue wasn't actually deposits to be mined around Victorio Peak. They think LaRue's mission happened upon the riches hidden away by Don Juan de Oñate before his exodus from New Mexico, originally mining for gold, but instead digging tunnels deeper into Oñate's trove once it was discovered. It's more than likely the story of Father LaRue is the real tale of the treasure's origins, as it's backed up with historical evidence, whereas there is no concrete proof Oñate ever found such riches, and his connections to the cache were more intertwined with the folklore of Cibola. The third tale of conquest-fueled treasure came another 60 to 70 years later, during the final days of Emperor Maximilian's reign over Mexico. Legend goes, Maximilian heard about the assassination plot against him, just in time to move the riches from his estate south of the border to a secret location in the United States. It's believed this location was none other than Victorio Peak, a cavernous network of tunnels, creating the perfect hiding place for an emperor's mansion worth of wealth. In 1867, Maximilian was indeed assassinated, and the whereabouts of the gold and jewelry he amassed went undetected. While much of the Victorio Peak treasure is rumored to originate from attempts at conquest by Spanish and Mexican rulers, one of the most popular theories actually centers on the legendary Apache war chief, Victorio, the man the mountain is named after. During the late 1870s, Chief Victorio and his band of Apache were ordered to move to the San Carlos Reservation in present-day Arizona. Victorio would have none of it though, seeing the demands as nothing more than a cruel banishment of he and his people. He fought hard for sovereignty in his homeland, and eventually, the federal government gave in to a compromise. For a brief time, Victorio and company were allowed to remain in New Mexico territory, away from the proverbial prison bars of San Carlos. In 1878, gold was struck in the hillsides of New Mexico, and in the snap of their fingers, the U.S. reneged the treaty, and settlers flooded into the Apaches' land. In response, Chief Victorio rounded up his finest warriors and raised ground between him and his now bitter American rivals. His strategy? Raid and plunder their targets of all their gold and wealth. Victorio couldn't care less about gold. It was worthless to many native tribes. But he and the others weren't ignorant to the United States' obsession with the element, and stole it whenever they stumbled upon a trove. This dedicated warpath, historically referred to as Victorio's campaign, lasted 2 years. Legend goes, this was enough time for the Apache chief to build up a large litany of treasure, taken from settlements all across the frontier. He fought Texas Rangers and the Buffalo Soldiers. He fought both the Mexican and U.S. Army. He fought gunslinging cowboys and the occasional courageous homesteader. His plunder hit locales in Texas and New Mexico. Wagon trains, stagecoaches, and any place of business that might harbor riches, like churches and postal offices, were not safe under the rampage of Victorio. At this time, Victorio used the Hembrio Basin as his headquarters, a hiding place for not just his army, but his secret cache of stolen treasure. It's believed everything he raided, saddles, stationery, gold, cash, and other valuable artifacts, ended up at the basin, and more specifically, in the intricate cave systems used by the Apache. Certain folklore also claim Victorio used the vast treasure rooms of his mountainsides to hold captive and torture his prisoners. It's said he would keep his adversaries alive, hold them on the brink of death, and made sure they suffered utter delirium in the dark and dim chambers of Victorio's Peak. It should be noted, however, much of Chief Victorio's life is well documented and researched by historians into the modern age, specifically his whereabouts and war efforts in the latter half of the 19th century. There has been nothing to suggest he tortured prisoners of war or withheld millions of dollars of gold and valuables in the mountainsides of the basin. But still, the legend remains. Folklore has been passed down through generation after generation, all regarding the origins of the Victorio Peak hidden treasure. However, none of it would exist, even oral tradition, had it not been for the serendipitous discovery made by Milton Doc Noss in 1937 that revealed the existence of such glory and riches. Doc Noss moved to Hatch, New Mexico in 1935. He and his wife, Ova Babe Noss, had been traversing the frontier ever since his release from the New Mexico State Penitentiary. They were in search of adventure, having tried their hand at homesteading to escape from the drudgery of the Great Depression. Their lives, the lives of their offspring, and the lives of their offspring's offspring would forever change in November of 1937. It was on a routine deer hunting expedition around the Hembrio Basin that Doc would make the discovery of a lifetime. During the hunt, rain clouds covered the sky and forced Doc, who was scouting the mountain's base at the time, to seek shelter. He found a favorable spot as he climbed higher up the hillsides, tucking under a large overhead just before Victorio's summit. As the rain poured harder, Doc had a look around and couldn't help but find curiosity with a stone that seemed specifically placed by another human being. He acted on the suspicion and dug around the rock, enough to put his hands underneath and force it from its position. Behind the rock was a large hole leading downward into Victorio Peak, and at this point, Doc had no other choice. He crawled into the shadows and found the remnants of an old mining shaft, or at least something man-made. Without a source of light or climbing gear, he returned to his campsite, informed Babe of his find, and the two kept it secret until they could return better prepared. Their plan worked wonders when they held their promise and came back to the mountains, equipped to the brim with ropes and lanterns. Doc's first discovery came in a small room some 60 feet into the caves. The walls were adorned with old indigenous drawings, as well as a few markings made by settlers. Another 60 feet later, he found an enormous series of caves and tiny rooms chiseled from within them. In these rooms were skeletons that had been tied to a stake, on their knees with hands tied to their backs. Whatever had happened to these unlucky souls, it was quite the tortuous way to die. Before he moved on, Doc reportedly found 27 skeletons, all in the same horrific state. It was his next stop in the cavernous chambers where he struck gold. Deep within Victorio's Peak sat mounds of gold coins, jewelry, statues, artifacts, letters, and best of all, gold bars, estimated to weigh around 40 pounds each. Combined, the treasure is said to have been worth around $2 billion in today's money, incomprehensible for the time period. Doc and Babe would then spend the next couple of years making weekend trips to the basin, taking out the treasure piece by piece. Legend goes, Doc grew paranoid the more they took from the caves, and would often hide hauls even from his wife, choosing to bury much of the gold in random spots throughout the desert, hiding spots only he knew. Part of the problem was also the recent laws made by the United States federal government. Congress had recently passed the Gold Act, technically known as Executive Order 6102, making it unlawful for private citizens to own and trade gold. So no matter how much bullion and bars he pulled from Victorio Peak, Doc only increased his wealth in theory. The one thing he could do was establish mining and treasure trove claims with the state of New Mexico, ensuring that the caverns of Hembrillo Basin remained untouched by anyone but he and Babe. Despite this, local newspapers picked up on the Noss couple's operation, and thus began the legend of the Victorio Peak hidden treasure. Everything came to a head, though, in the autumn of '39. Noss hired an engineer named S.E. Montgomery to help him open up the tunnels leading into the treasure caves. But Montgomery's faux expertise ended up closing entry to the mountains after the dynamite caved in the mine shaft. Over the next 10 years, Doc's personal and professional life started to severely crumble around him. He failed on attempt after attempt to reopen the Victorio Peak caverns, and divorced Babe in 1945. He also tried to sell most of the recovered gold and jewels on the black market in Arizona, only to find very few buyers were willing to engage. Time was running out, but Doc's lustful ego only strengthened. In 1948, the maligned yet eager explorer made his last effort to uncover the rest of the treasure. He hired a Texas oil driller named Charles Ryan to help him regain entry to the Victorio Peak mine shaft. Ryan agreed, but only on the condition he received $25,000 in gold bars as pay. In a twist, Babe Noss was keen on keeping the treasure for herself at the same time. She had filed a counterclaim for the trove at Hembrillo Basin with the courts, but the matter was tabled until legal precedent could be established for ownership of the mines. Doc thought that this would change Ryan's mind, and grew anxious that the West Texan would attempt to double-cross him. He went out into the desert and hid the $25,000 of gold bars underground, somewhere Ryan would never suspect. Unfortunately for Doc Noss, this would prove to be a fatal mistake. When he revealed to Ryan of his shenanigans, the oil driller threatened Doc's life if he didn't unveil the location of the gold. Doc argued vehemently with him, saying the deal was off. He then threatened Ryan and his family and retreated to his car. Anxious of an ambush, Ryan pulled out a gun and fired a warning shot, telling Doc to stop in his tracks. When he didn't halt, Ryan fired again. This time, the shot didn't miss, and the bullet slugged Doc in the head. The old explorer died with just $2.16 to his name, the secrets of all his buried gold of the New Mexico desert dying with him. It was as if the treasure never existed in the first place. For the next 75 years and counting, Babe Noss and her descendants would fight like mad to reclaim the mining rights at Victorio Peak, but mostly to no avail. The White Sands Missile Range overtook the Hembrillo Basin, and the U.S. Army has since overridden any trove or mining claims in the area. However, they themselves have been stopped when searching for the treasure, as Babe and Company have filed lawsuits any time drilling operations have gone underway. Between 1992 and 1996, the Noss family established a partnership to increase their personal mission to drill into the mountains. But the brief searches they held were unsuccessful. The US Army once again intervened, leaving the Noss family treasureless once more. Countless expeditions have been held by both expert and amateur hunters alike to retrieve the pockets of gold buried throughout New Mexico between 1937 and 1939 by Doc Noss. But even these efforts have proven fruitless. Without much physical proof of the treasures in existence today, it's anyone's best guess what truly happened to the hidden treasure of Victorio Peak. But one thing's for sure, whether the riches were born of conquest or revenge, only the powers of the US federal government control its fate now. A fate mostly lost to history of the frontier, left to live in the folklore of America evermore.